So, hello again, students, and welcome to another lecture on the course literature in the course Bioenergy Technology that you are taking. As you remember, the course literature is organized according to a matrix structure, and we have already covered the introductory chapters, row number 0, chapters 0100 through 0500. What we will do today is that we shall cover a column, the first column, the one about fundamental properties, and we shall have a very brief look at the chapters 0100 through 01004 and outline a little bit of what are the fundamental properties of different types of biomasses, why are they such as they are, and how does that affect the biomass itself. So, the first thing that you have to remember when talking about biomass is that biomass is produced by the photosynthesis process. And we shall have a brief look at the photosynthesis process, and to do that we shall open up the fuel analysis and description appendix, and we shall discuss the photosynthesis reaction. Now, in the appendix you will find a figure that describes the terminology to be used with biomass and the analysis of biomass. And you will notice that going from left to right in this figure, that we split biomass first in water and dry substance, and then we subdivide the dry substance into ash and a dry ash-free substance. This dry ash-free substance is also the combustible substance in the biomass. And the combustible substance is generally split into two groups, that is char and volatiles, where the volatiles are the gases given off during pyrolysis. Pyrolysis is that we heat up the biomass to 700 degrees without access to air or without access to oxygen, so that we prevent combustion. The biomass then splits into a gaseous and liquid set of compounds, which we call volatiles, and then we have a remainder, a solid remainder, that we call char, which is mainly composed of carbon, but also contains some other elements. The combustible substance can also be split into 4 organic groups of compounds, namely lignin, cellulose, hemicellulose, and extractives. And we will discuss these further in this lecture. And finally, we can do an elemental analysis of the combustible substance, and then we will find that it mainly consists of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and then there are some other elements present. Now, the reason that the combustible substance is composed by carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen is that these are the elements that are involved in the photosynthesis reaction, as shown on this slide, where the photosynthesis reaction is extremely simplified. It's simplified to the extent that this is not a correct description of the photosynthesis, but it gives a qualitative description. So carbon dioxide is taken up from the atmosphere. Water is taken up in liquid form via the roots of the plant. Solar energy is stored via the green parts of the plant and The chlorophyll plays an important role in this storage of solar energy. This forms energy-rich compounds which would have the summary formula CH2O. This is starch and sugars, simple compounds that combine into cellulose, hemicellulose, lignin, proteins, enzymes, whatever the plant is built up of. And as a side product of the photosynthesis, we also get oxygen gas. And this is the reason, the photosynthesis is the reason that we have 21% oxygen in the atmosphere on this planet. If there was no photosynthesis, we would basically have no oxygen to breathe. The most fundamental entity in living tissue is the cell, and there are basically two different types of cells. One is the plant cell. A plant cell will have a cell wall, and the cell wall will be composed of cellulose, hemicellulose and lignin. You can think of the plant cell wall as a composite built up by long cellulose fibers and hemicellulose fibers, which are glued together with lignin. And this is a fundamental entity with the plant cell. The cell wall, which is composed of fibers glued together with lignin, is what gives the cell a mechanical resistance and mechanical strength. If there was no cell walls, then a tree could never be as high as it is. The height and the weight of a tree requires a very high mechanical strength. The other type of cell is the animal cell. And the animal cell, like the ones that we are built up of, they will have no cell walls. They have cell membranes instead. And the cell membranes are built up by proteins and lipids, that is fats, basically. So an animal cell does not contain cellulose, hemicellulose and lignin, but instead it contains other substances. And this is a fundamental difference between the different cells. Inside the cells, inside the cell cavity, we will find a water solution in which there are nutrients, proteins, enzymes, and whatever the cell needs for its life. And this is common between plant cells and animal cells, that the cell liquid in the cell cavity contains these nutrients. To us, as energy engineers or energy technicians and energy planners, the nutrients and the minerals needed are ashes. So what you see in this figure is the cell wall being composed of lignin, cellulose and hemicellulose. You also find extractives, which is a fourth component, mainly terpenes, that are present in plants, and the terpenes, which are highly volatile, and they are can be given off in gas form already at very low temperatures. The terpenes or the extractives, they will act as an insecticide and a herbicide and protect the plant from microorganisms attacking it. Concentrating then on the plant cells with a cell wall composed of lignin, cellulose and hemicellulose. The cell wall is where the main part of the solar energy is stored. So the solar energy is stored in the three different compounds, lignin, cellulose and hemicellulose, lignin being the most energy rich of the three. For animals which cannot make use of solar energy via the photosynthesis, the solar energy or the energy needed to sustain life has to be taken up from plants. So animals eat plants, and they break down the plant cells to release the energy. Animals can make use of the energy stored in plants in two different ways. Ruminants will have a very specialized digestive system which can break down cellulose and hemicellulose very efficiently using bacteria and enzymes. But the drawback with them is that they breathe out methane gas, which contributes to the greenhouse effect. Non-ruminants, like horses for example, they have a very long appendix in which bacteria can break down cellulose, but they do not break it down as efficient as ruminants do. Ruminants are, for example, sheep, goats and cows, just to mention a few. Lignin is very difficult to digest, and generally speaking, lignin is found in the feces and the droppings of animals. So the most energy containing substance of all three, the lignin, cannot be utilized by most animals. Having now defined these major parts of the plant, we shall go back to the matrix and have a look at the different types of biomasses. Lignocellulose is called lignocellulose because it contains very high amounts of lignin and also very high amounts of cellulose. So if we go to chapter 0101, now we have to move it right, and we move down a little bit until we find a table. Not that one, but this one. Looking at this table, you will realize that the amount of cellulose plus hemicellulose plus lignin in hardwood as well as in softwood is about 90% or more. So this is why we call these substances lignocellulose. They have very high amounts of lignin, cellulose and hemicellulose. They need that to maintain a high mechanical strength and to have the possibility to become huge and very high and very large and very heavy. They need it to support their own weight. Since lignin is the most energy containing substance, you will notice also that lignocellulose has fairly high energy contents. Order of magnitude almost 20 megajoules per kilo. This is very high, and this is because of their high content of lignin. On the other hand, since lignin cannot be digested by most organisms, then lignocellulose does not lend itself very well to anaerobic or any other biochemical conversion process. If we now look at the properties of herbaceous biomass instead, then let's go down to properties and processes, and you will find that in herbaceous biomass you will have a higher percentage of hemicellulose and cellulose as compared to lignin. So there will be less lignin in herbaceous biomass. This is, of course, due to the fact that herbaceous plants are lower and less rigid than trees. So they do not need the great amounts of lignin to maintain the extreme mechanical strength that is required by the huge trees. On the other hand, the consequence of this, the consequence of the fact that the lignin content is lower, is also that the heating value is generally lower with herbaceous biomass than it is with lignocellulose. It's also so that with herbaceous biomass, the total amount of lignin plus cellulose plus hemicellulose is typically less than approximately 60%. The remaining part of the herbaceous biomass being proteins, sugars and fats. And this is the reason that animals will eat herbaceous biomass rather than lignocellulosic biomass. The herbaceous biomass contains much higher amounts of proteins and fats than ever a tree does. And as a consequence, the amounts of cellulose, hemicellulose and lignin are about 60% or less in herbaceous biomass. The high concentrations of proteins and enzymes and sugars in herbaceous biomass will also lead to a higher mineral content. So generally speaking, the ash content in herbaceous biomass is significantly higher than it is in lignocellulose biomass. And usually also the ash melting points are very much lower. So herbaceous biomass, from an energy engineering point of view, are not as good a fuel as lignocellulose. As you remember, lignin is basically not digestible, and since the herbaceous biomasses will have a very much lower lignin content than woody biomasses, then herbaceous biomass can be used anyway as a part of the substrate, also in biochemical conversion processes such as fermentation or anaerobic digestion. The lignin will not be digested, will basically not be fermented, but since there will only be a minor amount of lignin present if the substrate is built up by herbaceous biomass, then the total process efficiency may anyway be sufficiently high to motivate the existence of an anaerobic digestion plant. Looking at the third type of biomass, it's the putrescibles or the biodegradable biomasses. Now, biodegradable biomasses are characterized by the fact that they are easy to digest, and hence the demand is that a biodegradable biomass may not contain too much lignin. Looking at the definition and the fundamental terminology, you will realize that putrescible waste is a solid waste that contains organic matter capable of being decomposed by microorganisms and of such a character and proportion as to cause obnoxious odors, and also to be capable of attracting and providing food for birds or animals. This means that the putrescible waste is basically food. It's food for microorganisms, but it's also food for birds, for rodents, and for other animals that are unwanted. So basically, putrescible waste is a problem from a societal point of view because it can attract unwanted animals. So the handling, the supply, and the utilization of putrescible waste is subject to sanitary constraints and conditions that have to be met. Looking at the fundamentals and the properties demanded of a substrate to be putrescible or biodegradable is basically that there has to be not too much lignin. The putrescible wastes or the biodegradable wastes should mainly contain simple carbohydrates, proteins, fats, and cellulose and hemicellulose, not lignin. So if we go back now to the main table of the course literature, you will realize that the three groups, lignocellulose, herbaceous biomass, and putrescible biomass, are characterized and are separated, distinguished by their content, basically, of cellulose plus hemicellulose plus lignin. What we call lignocellulose will contain more than 90% of cellulose plus hemicellulose plus lignin. What we call herbaceous biomass will generally contain approximately 30 up to 60% of hemicellulose plus cellulose plus lignin. And for something to be called putrescible or biodegradable, there basically has to be less than approximately 15% of lignin. Otherwise, there will be the biochemical conversion process will become too inefficient. So these three groups, lignocellulose, herbaceous biomass, and putrescible biomass, are distinguished by their content of lignin. Other biomasses, as treated in this handbook, they will mainly be waste fractions from society. Waste fractions from society will consist of woody biomass, lignocellulose, mixed with herbaceous biomass and mixed with biodegradable biomass. You will now realize that the treatment and the processes suitable for the three main categories, lignocellulose, herbaceous, and biodegradables, the treatment processes become quite different because of the fundamental properties of the materials. And when we are talking waste fractions, it then becomes extremely important to keep these fractions separate. That is why source separation of waste is such an important part in a bioenergy-based system or a biomass-based energy system. You cannot mix lignin-rich material with biodegradable material and hope to get an efficient and well-working anaerobic digestion process with a high efficiency, because the lignin will basically not be digested. But if you keep the lignin, the wood waste, away from the biodegradable material, then you can use the wood waste in a boiler for electricity production, for district heating production, or for high temperature industrial processes. Whereas the biodegradable material, such as a fiber sludge from, example, a textile factory or maybe a wood processing factory or a pulp mill can be digested to produce a vehicle fuel in the form of biomethane. So the different properties of the different groups of biomass, the different lignin contents, the different contents of cellulose and hemicellulose are the main distinguishing factor for the different categories. And this has to be recognized, but it also has to be utilized when you want to make the most efficient use of the biomass that you have available in your region. Now, you will have realized that the cell walls and the cell wall structure are one distinguishing factor between different types of biomass, and that the cell wall is to a great extent determining for the types of processes that can be used. Now, materials without a cell wall are animal cells. In the first instance, animal cells. And animal cells are available as offals and in intestines from butcheries and food processing. They are available as liquid residues from, say, juice processing or oil processing from, again, food processing. They are available as fish rinsings, again, from food processing factories. So you will realize that food processing and agricultural-based industry are major sources for non-cell wall materials. And these materials are then well suited for biochemical conversion and would qualify as biodegradables or putrescibles. The same thing occurs, or the same thing applies to some marine biomasses, such as microalgae and some kelp. So aquaculture as well as agricultural industry may provide quite a wide base and a huge source of non-cell wall materials suitable for biochemical conversion. Now, there's one more group that fits into this category, and that is materials that have cell walls, that is plant cells, that have been already chemically treated or biochemically treated. You might not think of it, but that is what happens when something passes through the digestive system of an animal, a human, or any mammal, basically. So that means that manure droppings, including sewage sludge, poultry litter, etc., a lot of this kind of materials are also biodegradable materials and can easily be used to produce biomethane, and they will work fine as a substrate because their cell walls will already have been weakened or modified so as to make these material easy degradable. We will come into the constraints and the demands on the substrates that so as to make the substrates best biodegradable later on in the course. But you have to remember that biomass does not have to be virgin to be a raw material for energy processing. It does not have to be virgin. Biomass can be waste fractions. Biomass for energy production is sludge, industrial sludge, sewage sludge. Biomass for energy production is waste fractions, it's side product streams, it's a much wider set of materials than people very often realize. And this is one of the things that this course aims to teach you, to open up your eyes, look around you, and realize what type of resources you actually have around you. That was all for this lecture, which dealt with some of the fundamental properties of biomasses. See you again. Bye for now.